illustrates some of the work that I've done on Bosnia and peacekeeping in the past, putting it in the context of Bosnian politics in the last few years, and also ties it together more with thinking about kind of the relative significance of ethnicity and nationalism as ideas which explain conflict and explain post-conflict reconstruction. I mean, obviously, the Yugoslav wars and the war in Bosnia, which lasted between 1992 and 1995, they are examples of ethnopolitical conflict. But the more that you look at the Yugoslav wars, and even the more that you look at Bosnia, the more it becomes apparent that what was at stake was not just about inter-ethnic relations, was not just about ethnic difference. But there was also a big dimension of, first of all, the collapse of state socialism and the competition over resources which came out of that, and then post-war, the struggles for socio-economic justice as well as ethnopolitical recognition. And it turned out that the work that I was doing through Languages at War, particularly when it got to the point of doing interviews with Bosnians who had been locally recruited interpreters for the United Nations and then NATO forces, actually started revealing that very well in connection with work which anthropologists of Bosnia, for instance, were doing. So I'm going to say a bit more about the politics of it and the kind of relative significance of ethnicity in all of this. But let's start off with a bit of context about Bosnia and peacekeeping. So Bosnia, out of the post-Yugoslav successor states, it was one which experienced war for longest, well, in terms of the intensity of fighting between 1992 and 1995. War in Croatia started earlier, but it had its main flashpoints between the summer of 91 and the early winter of 92. There was when a ceasefire and the Bosnian war started at the end of March, beginning of April 1992. Bosnia was certainly the site of the longest international commitment of foreign military forces in peace support operations throughout the whole of the Yugoslav region. The first contingents of the United Nations Protection Force were deployed to Bosnia in 1992, and initially they were going to be the rear headquarters for the UN deployment to Croatia. Then Sarajevo, where they'd gone, turned out, of course, to be a front line of its own, and not a rear headquarters at all. So UN member states were then committing battalions and smaller units to Bosnia in summer 92, and the first British presence starts in Bosnia in August, September. Still today, there is a much smaller international military presence in Bosnia, including a NATO HQ in Sarajevo. Now, along the way, there's a multinational UN force in Bosnia until the Dayton Peace Agreement, December 1995. The UN years, of course, including the failure to protect the United Nations safe areas, and in particular, the failure to prevent genocide at Srebrenica. The UN ended its peacekeeping involvement in Bosnia with the Dayton Peace Agreement, and a NATO force replaced it. That was then there until 2004. But NATO continued after 2004 to have a presence through its headquarters to work on defence reform, which was integrating the three Bosnian militaries into one armed force, and then working with that military as part of the NATO Partnership for Peace. And that's even seen Bosnian contingents forming a junior part of the coalitions in Iraq and Afghanistan. Now, all of these different kinds of involvement have depended not just heavily, but constitutively, on translation and interpreting. Peacekeeping would not happen without translation and interpreting. Although how that's organised varies dramatically across the period of military presence in Bosnia, and very often even in different parts of Bosnia and different parts of the peacekeeping or peace enforcement structure. Okay, now what I've just gone through was the timeline of international peacekeeping, but really where an understanding of the context ought to start is the course of the conflict itself. One of the criticisms which has often been made of peacekeepers' cultural training, not just for Bosnia but anywhere, is that unless it's grounded in extensive and specific local knowledge, and unless it's given the time that it needs as well for peacekeepers to digest that and to kind of unlearn what they already think they know about the causes of conflict in a region. What can often happen is that peacekeepers arrive either seeing conflicts around the world as just interchangeable, and a series of identical and inexplicable civil wars, or seeing the different sides in a conflict as interchangeable. I've got to say, NATO kind of institutionalised that with their discourse of the former warring factions. That was the official NATO name for the three post-war armed forces which NATO officers and their language intermediaries would be conducting liaison with. Now, in fact, of course, there were three sides in the Bosnian conflict, and their capacity and their objectives were not equal. Now, if you think about Bosnia in terms of the geography of ethnopolitical conflict, what you can see on this map are two demographic maps of Bosnia. So obviously these are, it's always a bit of an essentialisation, reducing any population structure to a majority, but at least this map is trying to do it in a bit more of a complex way. You've got 1991, so before the war, on the left-hand side, last Yugoslav census. And then on 1998, you've got a post-war estimate. And so what you will see there are two processes at once, and both of those were results of the war and the way in which it was fought. So first of all, as results of ethnic cleansing and genocide and displacement, you will see in particular in eastern Bosnia the displacement of Bosniak majorities by the army of Republika Srpska. Srebrenica, by the way, is in eastern Bosnia, quite close to the border with Serbia. You will also see in western Bosnia and Herzegovina the effects of ethnic cleansing by the Croat Defence Council, and that was targeting both Bosniaks and Serbs and increasing that contiguous, what the HBO Croat Defence Council intended to take out of Bosnia and unify with Croatia. So, first of all, you will see the ethnic majorities changing as a result of ethnic cleansing and genocide. You will also see the relative intensity of majorities increasing, a relative increase in ethnic homogeneity in very many Bosnian communities. So, some of those light-coloured areas on the map are where majorities were smaller. You can see the colours are much thicker post-war. The majorities are much larger in proportion post-war. All of this is a decline of ethnic complexity. And we haven't even got into, at that point, the constitutional reduction of ethnic complexity, the institutionalisation of three ethnic identities in post-war Bosnian politics, Croat, Serb and Bosniak. That's through the Dayton Peace Agreement. Everybody else counts as a census category of others. There used to be more than a dozen other census categories in Yugoslavia. All of that has got reduced just to others now. Okay, so the geography of the ethnopolitical conflict in Bosnia gives a much more localised view of the kind of challenges which peacekeeping was going to involve. I can say more about the course of the conflict in particular regions if people want me to during the Q&A. So please, if something isn't clear about the account of a particular region, please do ask me more about that. So Bosnia for international peacekeeping is a paradigmatic example of an ethnopolitical conflict where the cause of the war, in the concept of ethnopolitical conflict, the cause of the war is inter-ethnic competition over territory, fuelled, as the image would often be, by ethnic hatred and memories of past ethnic violence. And peace, therefore, in the concept of what ethnopolitical conflict is, would have to involve reducing ethnic tensions and building inter-ethnic reconciliation. And of course that does go a long way to explaining the dynamic of the conflict in Bosnia. That is what was happening. Each of the three sides of the war was based on an ethno-national identity, and in two of those, on the VRS side, Army of Republika Srpska, and on the HVO side, the removal or killing of ethnic minorities through ethnic cleansing of towns or villages was part of their strategy. It was only on the side of the Sarajevo government that there was any multi-ethnic idea of national belonging, the so-called civic option. Even that actually became more and more politically marginalised as the war went on, in comparison to the notion that Bosnia ought to be a nation state for the Bosnian Muslims, or as they were often then and now known, the Bosniaks. I should acknowledge there are some cases of massacres which were committed by government troops and attacks on Serb or Croat objects of cultural heritage. These were much smaller in number, and the IC2I prosecutors have not found the same evidence of a strategy of targeting minorities embedded all the way up military and political command. I think that is an important difference, and although when we critique the idea of ethno-political conflict, we're critiquing lots of the assumptions about ethnicity, it is worth remembering as well that there was there were distinctions like that to be made. Okay, the Bosnian War was an ethno-political conflict, and the challenges which NATO troops would face in enforcing the Dayton Peace Agreement were those that follow ethno-political conflicts, particularly things like, in the immediate aftermath of Dayton, how do you ensure that armed forces in control of territory hand it over when that's necessary to enforce the territorial provisions of the peace agreements? Dayton essentially was a system of ethnic power sharing, and it was based on determining the ethnic identity of every piece of territory in Bosnia, and then drawing up a map on that basis. If we go back here to the NATO peacekeeping map, the pink shaded areas there are the post-Dayton Republika Srpska, that's the Serb entity, and the beige shaded areas are the Federation of Bosnia-Herzegovina. And that consisted of actually 10 subunits called cantons, and each one was devised as a Croat or a Bosniak or a mixed canton. One other area is just up in the northeast Birchco, so right in the corner, was actually a town which they couldn't decide on, even at Dayton, where should it be. And that was because of its strategic value, essentially. In order to get the agreement signed, it was basically kicked down the line for a few years. Again, speaking quite informally there, but that's what happened. And so it exists as the Birchco district, outside either one of those two entities. But essentially, the Dayton Peace Agreement was a system of ethnic power sharing, both in territorial terms and also in constitutional terms. So the ways in which people can use their votes and the sets of offices people can stand for are constrained by what ethnicity they declare as, which was challenged actually at the European Court of Human Rights by a Jewish activist and a Romani activist from Sarajevo, both of whom basically said, well, under this system, neither one of us could ever be president. And the ECHR, this was in 2009, said to the Bosnian state, you've got to change this. Obviously that means undoing Dayton. So it is, again, something which, like many other political issues in Bosnia, has not been addressed because it's not in the interests of any current political elites, really, to do so. Okay, now, criticisms of Dayton. One of the big criticisms is that it rewards ethnic cleansing, essentially. In particular, by preserving the RS as a large centralised entity extending to areas which the VRS purged of Bosniaks during the war, and that includes Srebrenica, actually. The Dayton settlement creates a lot of opportunities for clientelism and corruption. The wartime mayor or the wartime police chief in a town very often is usually still a powerful political figure, which can cause a lot of problems. And so many Bosnians, for different reasons, are very critical of the Dayton Peace Agreement, including, but not only, because of arguments like that, those who do identify with post-war narratives of ethnicised collective victimhood, will often feel hard done by the way the settlement turned out. So, the big Bosnian Croat argument against Dayton is there's not a third Bosnian Croat entity. Those who do not identify with such ethnicised narratives of victimhood, would tend to make the sorts of critiques that I was explaining a little bit earlier, that it actually enshrines this ethnopolitics in the Bosnian system going forward. Of course, viewing it from the 2000s or 2010s, it's a trade-off between was this necessary in December 1995 to prevent further organised violence versus what states that leave Bosnian politics and Bosnian society in now. Okay, so, that then is the, those are the ethnicised politics of post-conflict Bosnia, and those continue into the present day. So I'll say more later about how that's often experienced in everyday life. But then there's an immediate question from the Bosnian context and any other peacekeeping or peace enforcement context during or after ethnopolitical violence. Any ethnopolitical conflict is going to involve contestation over language because of that link between language and ethnicity. And it plays out in an interesting way in Bosnia, which I'll talk about. But in one way or another, any ethnopolitical conflicts bring language politics with it. So what does that then mean for the language politics of peace enforcement? What kinds of struggles over languages are there going to be? And then what's it mean for language policies? What are peacekeeping forces actually going to do about this in the course of getting stuff done? Now, we know from the research through Languages at War, where you see these policies at work is through practice. What do the peacekeepers do, and also what do their language intermediaries actually do? That's a really important question. One of the things that motivated this project right at the beginning, when Hilary and Mike Kelly were first talking about it, is the insight from translation studies that the agency and the autonomy of translators and interpreters, nearly always goes neglected by people outside translation and interpreting. Because, they often just take it for granted. Source language goes in, target language magically comes out, and, any translator or interpreter will tell you it is much messier than that. But then if nobody else in an interaction understands that, and the institutions behind the interaction don't really get that either, the result is the kind of complex and micro-political but ever-present negotiations that interpreters and translators were having to make between what and how they were asked to translate, how that was going to be received, and their own agency regarding what they were there to do. That is then further conditioned by things like how far did they identify with or identify against the community or the institution that they were talking to, or the foreign military force they were working for. And indeed, even things like what did they think was the best way of achieving what's referred to as their user in interpreting studies wants them to do, which might not be the same way that the user thought was best. You can picture, for instance, a British officer turning up to a military liaison meeting with a show of bluster, and then the interpreter from his or her point of view, from their point of view, thinking, okay, I know more about who we're visiting and where we're visiting than this officer does, and a soft approach is going to be more persuasive. There was an interpreter I spoke to who had done this a lot at Gorashia when he was working with the British forces there in '94. So the result then would be you get a kind of performance of anger in English by the officer, and something much more mollifying, and probably quite distancing maybe as well, by the interpreter. And although most officers wouldn't understand what was being said, they'd see a difference in tone between what they'd said and what was coming out. So many of these encounters in peacekeeping are, kind of performances of power and performances of security. Right from the beginning in Bosnia, the Canadian colonel who was advising Lieutenant Bob Stewart, who was the CEO of the 1st British Battalion to go out there, Stewart on his first reconnaissance got told by the Canadian CO, look, make sure you've got impressive military vehicles, and make sure you've got enough interpreters. So, you know, in some other work I've kind of used that idea of everyday performance as a security to think more about that side of it. Now, these of course are very field-based examples, and they're particularly characterised by the war itself and also the first few years after Dayton. As Bosnia stabilised, more and more language encounters were meeting room-based or desk-based, or something that they did in civil affairs in the late 1990s, started operating out of townhouses, you know, because that was better than being on a locked-up military base. Throughout all the ways in which the nature of peace support operations were changing, the question of language intermediaries' agency remained. So that gets us on to the really interesting thing of Bosnia as an example of language policies in peacekeeping post-ethnopolitical conflict, or during it, which is simultaneously one of the simplest sets of local language needs and one of the most complex. Basically, Bosnian, Serbian and Croatian are all mutually intelligible languages. In Yugoslavia, they've been known as one language, Serbo-Croatian, which had two variants, an Eastern variant and a Western variant. And people understood that as a variant from Serbia and the variant from Croatia. There had been demands for recognition of Croatian as a separate language during state socialism, and then on becoming independent, the Croatian state could put that into practice and was very keen to do so, to put it mildly. Now, the two variants also had two scripts, Cyrillic and Latin. Translated into today's language politics, Croatian only uses Latin. Serbian symbolically is attached to Cyrillic, but also is often written in Latin for everyday purposes. And then in Bosnia, both variants of Serbo-Croatian coexisted, and so do all three present-day languages. Cyrillic and the Eastern variants much more associated with Serbia and Serb ethnicity as a result of the war. The Republika Srpska tried to impose Cyrillic script only, and even tried to impose the Eastern variant across all of its territory, although Serbs in northwest Bosnia themselves spoke Western variants. So it had all these demands for separate language recognition, particularly from pro-separation Croats, who were demanding that Croatian be recognised as a separate national language alongside Bosnian. You can see here what this ends up with, a free language policy. If it was a more complex sentence, you'd see more differentiation. That is exactly the same sentence, sounds exactly the same in Croatian, Bosnian and Serbian, including two identical variants because they're both in Latin script, the Croatian and Bosnian. So the mutual intelligibility meant you didn't need two separate cadres of interpreters like you did in Kosovo. In Kosovo, when NATO troops went in from June 1999, they had to have Serbian-speaking interpreters and Albanian-speaking interpreters. So the Albanian speakers were recruited from Kosovo and Albania, plus Albanian diaspora. The Serbian speakers actually came mostly from Macedonia initially, and then a smaller number of Serbian speakers from Serbia, where NATO, of course, after the airstrikes was much more unpopular, did start working for the KFOR later on. But in Bosnia, unlike Kosovo, practically there was one local mutually intelligible language. Symbolically, on the other hand, it was nothing of the kind. Every interaction in Bosnia across foreign and local languages was going to be addressing one or more people who had one or more opinions about the politics of language recognition. And that would depend on things like what kinds of claims to identity and recognition were being made by groups that they belonged to or were others from, as well as how they positioned themselves in relation to those claims. So not everybody who is, ethnically a Croat or in terms of religion a Catholic supported the demand of the leading Bosnian Croat political party for documents to be in all three languages. So translators and interpreters would be having to figure this out all the time. This is, if you're Bosnian, this is everyday knowledge. How are you going to address somebody? How are you going to adapt how you speak and write to how they speak and write, depending on how you want that interaction to go. Translators and interpreters, would have their own knowledge of that. They'd be having to figure that out for every language encounter they have, almost always with much more nuance than the peacekeepers they were working for. And again, peacekeepers' impressions would probably range from either, oh, it's all the same language and they just need to cope with it, which kind of, again, reporting about quite bluntly, but, it would be reported sometimes in those sort of terms, all the way through to somebody who had been told, right, there's Bosnian, there's Serbian, Croatian, don't ever mix them up, and believe that they were three completely separate languages, like Serbian and Albanian. In the middle of that, you would have people who had taken more trouble to find out about the language politics before they went. Really does need saying, there were some, when we spoke to peacekeepers, excellent examples, including from branches which themselves didn't have much to do with languages or even liaison. Another thing that would happen, peacekeepers who listened to their interpreters, in breaks, on patrols, etc., would pick up more knowledge about this over the 6 months usually that they were there. Interpreters were really responsible for a lot of this kind of cultural and historical mediation if peacekeepers were able to take it in and to critically reflect on what they might have been told in a more rough and ready way in pre-deployment training. So that kind of everyday micro-political dimension of peacekeeping and the production of knowledge and international intervention, to give it a grand political turn, can often come down to peacekeepers chatting with the interpreter in coffee breaks. But this is where a lot of this happens. Okay, so how would interpreters then be handling this? Like we said, in practice, mutually intelligible language or languages, but for symbolic politics, very different. One of the things that they might do, Louise Askew has written an interesting book chapter on this, is that they would try in their communication to try and find a middle way of expressing themselves, probably easier than written communication. Or maybe not. I mean, in spoken terms, some of the symbolics won't come into it. But when you're writing this language or these languages, you can use language choice and grammar choice to emphasise that you're using one particular variant, or try and disguise that as much as possible. So in Louise Askew's chapter, she was talking with very professionalised interpreters at the NATO headquarters in Sarajevo. They had years of experience by this point, and so they had the strategy of finding a middle way and minimising the points at which a choice would have to be made. And all of this, of course, was going to be mediated through how somebody positioned themselves in relation to post-war ethnopolitics in general. That's kind of the wider point here. Sometimes in interviews that would actually come across directly. So if somebody was explaining the context to the war and to their post-war work, they would be given an account of the conflict as well. Now, while they didn't all share the same politics by any means, and their relationship to these public narratives of ethnic identity and Bosnianness was always going to be shaped by where they'd been during the war and what they'd experienced during and after it. It was still very rare, I think, and this clearly reflects the people who I met and people who chose to speak to me. It was very rare for them to repeat the kinds of narratives of collective victimhood on an ethnic basis, which in the mainstream political arena in Bosnia still dominate the main party's political claims. Now, this then relates to a wider question about political empowerment and political disempowerment, which is where the people studying Bosnian politics, Bosnian identities today, are very much talking about political participation. And so that made me think again about empowerment, agency, disempowerment in the narratives of local interpreters. Throughout the work I was doing for Languages at War, throughout the book on languages and peacekeeping I wrote with Mike Kelly, which is called Interpreting the Peace, a lot of examples of interpreters, and some peacekeepers as well, using the agency of language intermediaries to become active participants in the interlinguistic and intercultural encounters of peacekeeping, far more than the black boxes or maybe orange boxes they were thought to be when you, in remarks like the commander of one British unit based at the shoe factory in Konieczgrad, as reported by an interpreter who had felt understandably offended by this, had heard the CO telling troops going out on patrol, "Don't forget your satellite phone and your interpreter." And in the context of other ways in which the British division of NATO had treated her, she really felt quite dehumanised at being compared to a satellite phone. And all the more so after an incident where a platoon of young male soldiers had been racing their armoured vehicles, with the interpreters having to sit unsecured in the back of them, and she then got hit by the case of one of these very satellite phones. Now, this fear of injury was not an isolated fear at all among not only wartime interpreters, when you were vulnerable to all of the risks of travelling in convoy and the risks of sniper fire, but also among post-war interpreters. The reason for that fear, which came up again and again when I was asking interpreters to talk about everyday experiences of theirs, points to what I'm going to talk about in the final bit of this talk. It was not just a matter of one human being putting one another in danger, or even the imbalance of power between a locally recruited interpreter and a foreign military force or a private military contractor which had hired them. It was actually, and fundamentally, a consequence of the state of post-war Bosnian politics and the post-war Bosnian economy. And these are things which had as much to do with the collapse of state socialism as they had to do with the war itself. So, ethnopolitical conflict, although it is about ethnicity, is also about more than that. It's about the breakdown of social and economic structures, it's about the competition for resources, it's about the instrumentalisation of ethnicity, often as a strategy for organised criminals and wartime elites to take control of resources. Even before the war in Bosnia broke out, the whole of Yugoslavia was going through the same dislocations of privatisation and social precarity. That continued after war, of course. So it was going through the same things as Bulgaria and Poland, plus the after effects of ethnopolitical conflict, similar to other peacekeeping settings like Cyprus. All of this left the Bosnian state in an extremely poor condition to provide healthcare for serious injuries, or provide temporary security for somebody who had lost their job because the peacekeeping force had downsized. Bosnians knew this, and they knew that if they did get injured, they'd be falling down a real gap between the army and defence ministry of the foreign government which had employed them, the international organisation these troops had been part of while they were in Bosnia, and their home state. So from this real everyday insecurity that locally recruited interpreters were exposed to, we get into deep structural dynamics, which in different ways have affected the whole of Bosnian society and are intensely political issues. Yet are very rarely the stuff of party politics in Bosnia, in a way that seeks to solve them, rather than just blame an ethnopolitical rival for the problem being there. So this moves on then to think more about political participation and ethnopolitics in a wider sense. I was going to say political empowerment and disempowerment, but actually most of it is disempowerment. The thing to remember here about ethnopolitical conflict, part of its dynamic is a marginalisation of political and social alternatives, anything which is not based on the public identifying primarily as members of one opposed ethnic group or another opposed ethnic group. So Eric Gordy, for instance, uses the phrase destruction of alternatives when he's talking about Milosevic. V.P. Gagnon, another sociologist of the war in Croatia and Serbia, uses the phrase demobilisation. It's not just about mobilising the public around ethnic tension, it's also about demobilising anything else which is important. That began before violence even started taking place. So it began before the conflict, and it is just as much one of the long-term effects of the conflict as the painful memories of mass violence which have derived from it. Now, with all of that being the case, what then are the prospects for political participation? People being able to take political action together in ways which are not structured by the ethnopolitics built into the Dayton constitutional system. That's probably the most important question that needs answering in Bosnia for the sake of its own stability and prosperity. It's probably the most important question being asked by researchers of Bosnia as well. Essentially, the nationalist parties which were in power during the war remain in power. Though the ruling party in the IRS has a different name from the wartime Serb Democratic Party, but in terms of its Serb ethnocentric position, is in continuity with it. There are one or two multi-ethnic parties. They have much smaller bases than any of the nationalist ones. So there's the Social Democratic Party, which is what's left of the reformed Communist Party. There was also, founded in 2008, the explicitly non-nationalist Naša Stranka, our party. That uses actually the first person plural, the same way that if you don't want to give a name, an ethno-national name to the local language in Bosnia, and you're from anywhere in the Yugoslav region, you'll probably say naš jezik, our language, and it's the same thing there that Naša Stranka does. But they are trying to appeal to the whole of Bosnia, regardless of ethnicity. In practice, what their support base is tends to be people who identify themselves with the sort of alternative, what's called civic option, rather than being a genuinely mass party. So it's quite a small support base, but does represent probably the most defined non-nationalist alternative. There's other parties now which try to do the same thing. Okay, now what's this got to do with interpreters? Well, interpreters, of course, like anybody else, are socially situated beings. They're situated in the ethnopolitics of post-war Bosnia. They're also situated in something which peacebuilding scholars call the peacekeeping economy. The peacekeeping economy is basically a concept that links the formal and informal impacts of peacekeeping forces and intervention agencies being present somewhere. Now, within the Languages at War project, what ended up getting me to write almost as much as I was meant to for the entire whole project was the part about how these usually but not always young Bosnians and other ex-Yugoslavs had negotiated the contradictions of Bosnia's wartime economy and Bosnia's post-war economy. And when we were doing this, we found that was particularly what people were interested in talking about. When you started posing questions about everyday experiences, what you tended to get were narratives which brought out those sorts of issues. Those are what people were thinking about at the time that I was meeting them, and those are what people wanted to put on record as the background and context to the things that I was asking about. As I've already said when we were talking about the fear of injury and what was going to happen to you, they used what they were explaining is something which in the case of Kosovo has been called the accountability gap. Gazing Visoko writes about this of Kosovo. He's not talking about anything to do with interpreters particularly, he's talking about the relationship between international organisations and the local state. Basically, there is a gap in accountability down which a lot of the activities of international intervention actually fall, and a lot of international governance, which is what he's really interested in, falls down that gap. But it extends out into these kinds of everyday social structures as well, and kind of micro-politics even of intervention. So that then leads me to the question, okay, well, if interpreters have had, such distinctive experiences, and, also they had a, quite distinctive combination of social and economic and cultural capital. They, on the face of it, just as much in the social identity category as all of the other ones, which in post-war Bosnian society you get associations of veterans, of ex-refugees, of ex-prisoners, of mothers that have disappeared. So many of these post-war social identities, and yet there isn't a sort of consciousness of that in a formalised way among interpreters. There are, however, very strong social ties between people who work together. Now, there are some for whom all of this together has informed how the political action they do take. And I got quite interested in a Bosnian author and activist, and it turned out ex-interpreter, called Veselin Gatalo. And he's from Mostar. One of his novels is actually about the late 1990s in Mostar, and an interpreter who was injured in an accident in a French and Spanish military vehicle. And again, he was talking about that accountability gap, and it wasn't, it's no one's responsibility in the novel for the long-term care of that character who gets injured. And he is also somebody who is involved in explicitly non-nationalist, anti-activist, what's called in Bosnia civic activism. He was one of the group who, in 2005, some of you might have heard about this, put up a statue of Bruce Lee in Mostar. And the reason for that, basically, was it was a kind of intervention in local memory politics. Lots of big monuments being put up in Mostar, particularly by the Croatian Democratic Union of Bosnia-Herzegovina, which is the main Bosnian political party. And any ethnicized or in a post-war context religious monuments, ends up, it marks space, it marks territory as, one or other ethnic group's territory. Got a kind of competition of memory politics through monuments. So putting up a statue of Bruce Lee, A, cannot be claimed by any one ethnic group. B, something which thousands of people in Yugoslavia loved watching Bruce Lee films. So it is, unifying and non-nationalist at the same time. And obviously it's then meant to be a talking point. Why is there such a Bruce Lee in Mostar? Well, for exactly those reasons. So that kind of artistic cultural intervention. Members of Bosnia's alternative intellectual and creative and cultural scenes have quite often, not one-to-one correspondence by any means, quite often, have worked as, either interpreters or, in other sorts of capacities that involve linguistic and cultural mediation for foreign intervention agencies. And in fact, in the 2000s, quite a lot of exchange between working as an interpreter and working as a project officer. All of this in at the same time in local terms, well paid and hard currency, but also, very insecure over the longer term of things. Context. I titled one article on this, Prosperity without Security, because of that. So, whether or not interpreters or ex-interpreters have, directly participated in politics in this way, the experiences that they've had of ways in which they talked about them in this project were not primarily defined by ethnicity. Although of course, they were shaped by them, to an extent, ethnicity and people's relationship towards that was part of the lens through which people saw things. this then brings us towards is, what can we learn from this and bring it out again? About the everyday politics in a wider sense of international intervention. And apologies to Hilary, who's heard some of this last week. The study of peace building in international relations has taken what's called an everyday turn, often. And it's looking at, on one hand, the kinds of material spaces of intervention. I used that phrase, performances of security, earlier. The kind of embodied experiences of peacekeeping. Literally, what do peacekeepers actually do? And you can fit looking at language encounters as well as cultural encounters, very much into that, as well, of course, as look at the agency of language intermediaries. And yet that doesn't always happen, even in very good work which is pushing this forward. And a really interesting book on knowledge production in international intervention, which Severino Desser did a couple of years ago, called Peaceland. And based on huge amounts of field work in many more places for much longer than I've ever done. And yet, even in that, despite how good it is, there is still, almost only a page or two on the processes of translation and interpreting the politics of that. So even within this kind of everyday turn of study of peace building, there is still more to say, and what more there is to say, is going to come from thinking about not just the international and the local skills of analyses, not even just the ways in which those might subdivide or blow into each other, but also through what sorts of filters, through what sorts of mediations does knowledge go through. I think that ultimately will help to answer some of these questions about why does locally produced knowledge, even though people say that they want it so much, keep getting forgotten? And what is most likely to get not easily translated into the reports in English, which it turns out that peace building, as well as development and democratisation and stabilisation activities, all end up actually running on most of the time. Okay, so to conclude then, what we've been able to do is by starting with, something which seemed very specific, these narratives of the everyday experiences that interpreters had. This is them talking about, anything between 1992 and 2007 or 8 or so, from the point of view of 2009 and 2010. And you could sometimes see present-day politics being a filter through which we'll talk about their memories of the past. By starting with that, we actually get insights into the into the political economy of post-conflict, post-socialist Bosnia, and we get maybe even more of the dynamics of the everyday turn in peace building than most of the peace building literature does. So I would be very interested to hear, from those who have heard the rest of the series, actually, the discussion which I hope we can have. How this actually chimes with what you heard in the other talks and in other kinds of sectors and settings. Thank you.